Come close now. Come gather round this fire that burns with memories older than cotton fields, older than auction blocks, older than the Middle Passage itself. Tonight the spirits whisper heavy in the bayou wind, and they brought me a name that makes even the dead tremble in their graves. Set yourselves down, children, and open your hearts to a story that ain't written in no white man's book, but lives in the blood of our people and the red clay of Mississippi. Tonight I tell you about Sophia of the whipping post, the woman who carried 45 days of iron nails in her neck and crushed a overseer's skull against those very same spikes. Lord have mercy on my soul for what I'm about to tell, but some stories got to be told, even when they cut like a blade through your chest. This here tale ain't for the weak-hearted, ain't for them that turn their eyes from suffering. This is memory made flesh, pain made sacred, and justice served cold as grave dirt. In them dark days when cotton was king and human souls were currency, there lived a name that even the wind feared to speak too loud. Sophia, they called her. But not just Sophia. The old folks in the quarters whispered Sophia of the whipping post, and when they said it, they crossed themselves and looked over their shoulders, 'cause some names carry power that can wake the dead. Now listen here, children, and don't you mistake what I'm tellin' for no fairy tale. This woman was born in the belly of a slave ship crossing them cursed waters of the Middle Passage, where the ocean floor is paved with the bones of our ancestors. Her mama, strong-willed woman that she was, died chained to the deck with her newborn pressed against her chest. But before the Lord called her home, she breathed something fierce into that baby's lungs. Something that made Sophia different from the moment she drew breath. The ship's captain, mean old devil with eyes like winter frost, looked at the dead woman and the crying child and said, "Throw 'em both overboard." But the ship's doctor, man who'd seen too much death to be comfortable with waste, said, "That baby's strong. She'll bring good money at the Charleston auction block." So they pried little Sophia from her mama's cold arms and fed her goat's milk mixed with molasses till they reached the Carolina coast. Even as a baby, no bigger than a corn husk doll, folks say she never cried like other children. She wailed, deep mournful sounds that seemed to carry voices of all them souls lost beneath the waves. At that Charleston auction block, where human misery was bought and sold like tobacco and rice, Sophia was purchased by a plantation master from Mississippi named Colonel Beauregard Wexford, mean-spirited man with a reputation for breaking spirits faster than wild horses. He looked at that tiny child, barely 2 years old, and said to his overseer, "This one's got fire in her eyes. You make sure that fire gets put out before it spreads. But fire, once it's born in the soul, don't die easy." The plantation where Sophia grew up was called Wexford Manor, sprawled across 3,000 acres of Mississippi Delta land, where the cotton grew tall as a man and twice as greedy. The slave quarters sat a quarter-mile from the big house, rows of wooden cabins with dirt floors and roofs that leaked when the rains came hard. Each cabin housed 8 to 10 souls, packed tight as cargo in a ship's hold. The overseer was a man named Silas Thorne, and if Satan himself had spit out a son, it would have looked like Silas. Tall as a cypress tree and twice as gnarled, with pale eyes that seemed to see right through to your soul and find every secret fear hiding there. He carried a braided whip made of bull hide and called it Sweet Mary, and when he cracked that whip, it sang through the air like a mockingbird's last song. Sophia grew up knowing that whip's voice better than any lullaby. From the time she could walk, that child showed signs she wasn't meant for breaking. While other children learned to keep their eyes down and their voices quiet, Sophia would look straight at Silas Thorne when he passed, her dark eyes burning with something that made him mighty uncomfortable. The other slaves noticed it too, how she'd help the sick ones even when it meant less food for herself, how she'd sing work songs in languages none of them recognized, but all of them felt in their bones. "That child carries old spirits," Mama Cora used to say. Mama Cora was the eldest in the quarters, a conjure woman who knew the old ways from across the water. Her mama's people still walking with her. I can see 'em in her shadow. And sure enough, when Sophia was about 7 years old, strange things started happening around the plantation. Plants would grow overnight in spots where she'd been working. Sick animals would get well after she touched them. And sometimes on nights when the moon was dark, folks swore they could hear drums beating soft and low, coming from wherever that child was sleeping. Silas Thorne heard them stories, and they made his blood run cold as January creek water. By the time Sophia reached her 15th year, she'd grown into a woman that carried herself like freedom was her birthright, even though she'd never known nothing but chains. She was small-built, no bigger than a willow branch, but there was steel in her spine and lightning in her eyes. When she walked through them cotton fields, it was like watching a queen move through her kingdom, even if that kingdom was built on blood and tears. The other slaves, they loved her fierce as family, 'cause Sophia never let nobody suffer alone. When Master Wexford cut the food rations that hard winter, she found ways to stretch the cornmeal and fat back to feed the children. When old Samuel got too sick to work, and Silas threatened to sell him downriver, Sophia took on his share of the cotton picking, without being asked. But it was her spirit that scared the white folks most. The way she'd sing them old songs while she worked, songs that seemed to make the very air tremble, songs in languages that predated slavery, that carried memories of kingdoms across the water where black skin was royalty, not property. Silas Thorne, he'd been watching Sophia with eyes like a hawk circles a field mouse, waiting for his chance to break what couldn't be broken. He'd tried everything: extra work details, reduced rations, threats against the other slaves, but nothing seemed to touch that fire burning inside her. "Colonel," he said to Master Wexford one evening as they sat on the big house porch drinking bourbon and counting their money, "that Sophia girl's become a problem. The other slaves look to her like she's some kind of leader. That kind of thinking spreads like wildfire through the quarters." Colonel Wexford, sipping his drink from crystal glasses that cost more than most slaves saw in a lifetime, nodded slow and thoughtful. "What you suggest we do about it, Silas?" "Break her," Silas said, and when he spoke them words, his pale eyes gleamed like a cottonmouth's in moonlight. "Break her public, break her hard, break her permanent. Show the others what happens when they start getting ideas above their station." That autumn brought news that set the whole plantation on edge. Word came from up north about slave rebellions, about something called the Underground Railroad, about black folks fighting for their freedom with guns and determination. Master Wexford called all the slaves to the yard in front of the big house and had Silas read new rules about gatherings and prayers and moving about after dark. But Sophia, she stood in that crowd with her head held high while other folks trembled. And when Silas's eyes found hers across that yard full of fear, she didn't look away, didn't bow her head, didn't even blink. That night, in the quiet of the quarters when most folks were sleeping, Sophia sat with Mama Cora by the dying embers of their cabin fire. The old conjure woman was sewing a mojo bag with red flannel and graveyard dirt, her gnarled fingers moving quick and sure in the orange light. "Child," Mama Cora said without looking up from her work, "storm's coming. I can feel it in my bones, hear it in the spirit's whispers. That white devil been planning something wicked for you." Sophia nodded slow, like she'd been expecting this news. "I know it, Mama Cora. Been dreaming about my mama every night this week. She keeps telling me to be ready, that the ancestors are gathering." "You scared?" the old woman asked. Sophia was quiet for a long moment, staring into them dying coals like she could see the future writing itself in fire and ash. "I ain't scared of dying, Mama Cora. I'm scared of living without dignity. My mama died in chains, but she died free in her heart. That's what she passed to me." Mama Cora finished the mojo bag and pressed it into Sophia's hands. It was warm as fresh bread and hummed with power older than memory. "This here's for protection, child. Won't stop what's coming, but it'll make sure you don't walk through it alone. Your ancestor's gonna be right there with you." 3 days later, it began with a lie, the way most evil does. A young boy named Timothy, barely 8 years old and thin as a cornstalk from chronic hunger, collapsed in the cotton fields from weakness. Sophia found him there, shaken and fevered, and carried him to the shade of an old oak tree. She gave him water from her own cup and a piece of cornbread she'd been saving for supper. Silas Thorne came riding up on his gray mare, cracking Sweet Mary through the air like thunder. "What's this?" he demanded. dismounting with the slow deliberation of a man who enjoyed other people's fear. "Boy's sick," Sophia said, standing between Silas and little Timothy. "Just needs water and rest." "Sick, is he?" Silas smiled, and it was like watching a snake show its fangs. "Or maybe he's just lazy. Maybe you're teaching these children to fake sickness to get out of honest work." "That ain't true and you know it," Sophia replied, her voice steady as stone. But Silas wasn't interested in truth. He was interested in opportunity, and he'd finally found one. The morning they came for Sophia, the mockingbird stopped singing. Even nature knew something terrible was about to unfold under that Mississippi sun. Dawn broke red as blood over them cotton fields, and the very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm that was coming. Silas Thorne arrived at the slave quarters before the work bell rang, accompanied by 3 white men from town, paddy rollers who made their living catching runaway slaves and breaking rebellious spirits. They rode up to Sophia's cabin like the 4 horsemen of Judgment Day, their horses snorting steam in the cool morning air. "Sophia!" Silas called out, his voice cracking through the quiet like his whip through flesh. "Come on out here, girl. Time to answer for your crimes." Sophia stepped from the cabin door slow and dignified, wearing the same patched cotton dress she wore every day, but carrying herself like it was made of silk and gold. Behind her, other slaves emerged from their own cabins, faces tight with worry and fear. They knew this day had been coming, but knowing and seeing are 2 different kinds of pain. "What crimes you speaking of?" Sophia asked, though she knew the answer didn't matter. When white men wanted to punish a black soul, they'd invent reasons like children make up games. "Theft," Silas said, enjoying each word like it was sweet molasses on his tongue. "Yesterday you were seen giving food to that lazy boy Timothy, food that belongs to Master Wexford. That makes you a thief, and thieves got to be punished according to the law. But this wasn't about no stolen cornbread, and everybody present knew it. This was about breaking the one spirit on the plantation that refused to bow. This was about showing the other slaves what happened when they started believing they were human beings instead of property." "I shared my own food," Sophia said quietly. "Ain't no law against kindness. Ain't no law against it," Silas agreed. Then his voice turned hard as winter iron. "But there's plantation rules about encouraging laziness, about undermining discipline, about forgetting your place." He gestured to the paddy rollers, and they dismounted with the easy confidence of men who'd done this work many times before. They carried rope and chains, and their eyes held the kind of emptiness that comes from years of treating human souls like livestock. As they approached Sophia, the other slaves pressed closer, forming a circle around their loved one. Mama Cora stepped forward, her ancient hands raised like she was calling down protection from the ancestors themselves. "Don't you touch that child," the old conjure woman said, her voice carrying power that made the white men hesitate. "She ain't done nothing but show Christian mercy to a suffering boy." Silas laughed, but it was a hollow sound, like wind through a dead tree. "Get back, old woman, before you join her at the whipping post. This here's plantation business, and your conjure tricks don't scare nobody." But as he spoke them words, something strange happened. The morning mist that had been hovering over the cotton fields began to swirl and thicken, moving against the wind like it had a mind of its own. The horses started dancing nervous, their eyes showing white with fear of something their riders couldn't see. Sophia felt the mojo bag Mama Cora had given her growing warm against her chest, and suddenly she could hear voices, whispers in languages she'd never learned but somehow understood. Her mama's voice strongest among them, singing one of them old songs that carried memories of home across the water. "Time to go, girl," one of the paddy rollers said, reaching for Sophia's arm. But as his hand touched her skin, he jerked it back like he'd grabbed a hot coal. "Jesus Christ," he swore. "She's burning up." Sophia wasn't fevered, though. She was lit from within by something older and stronger than fear. The accumulated prayers of every ancestor who died in chains, the collected hopes of every slave who dreamed of freedom, the gathered rage of every mother who'd watched her children sold away like cattle. "I'll walk," she said simply, and started moving toward the whipping post without waiting for their commands. Her people fell in behind her, a slow procession of witnesses who knew they were about to see either a breaking or a resurrection. The whipping post stood in the center of the plantation yard, a thick oak beam driven deep into the red clay earth. Its surface was stained dark with the blood of countless punishments, scarred and gouged from years of human suffering. Attached to the post were iron rings where prisoners were bound, and at its base grew nothing. Not even weeds would take root in soil so saturated with pain. But today, Silas Thorne had ordered special preparations. Driven into the post at head height were 12 iron spikes, each one sharp as a blacksmith's nail and long enough to pierce through to the other side. They'd been positioned so that anyone tied to the post would have to choose between standing straight and being cut, or slumping forward into even greater agony. When Sophia saw them spikes, she stopped walking for just a moment. Not from fear, but from understanding. This wasn't meant to be punishment. This was meant to be slow murder, drawn out over days or weeks until her spirit finally broke or her body finally died. "You see what defiance brings?" Silas called out to the assembled slaves. "You see what happens when you forget that you're property, not people?" But Sophia, she turned to face her people one last time before they bound her to that cursed post. Her eyes swept over every face, young and old, scared and angry, broken and still fighting. And when she spoke, her voice carried clear across the yard. "Remember my name," she said. "Remember that I stood here free in my heart, no matter what they do to my flesh. And when you sing your work songs tonight, sing one for me. Not a mourning song, but a song of resistance." Then she walked the last few steps to the whipping post and pressed her back against them iron spikes, feeling their sharp points bite into her neck and shoulders. The paddy rollers bound her wrists to the iron rings, pulled the ropes tight until her arms stretched wide like she was embracing the whole world's pain. Silas Thorne stepped back to admire his handiwork. Sweet Mary coiled in his hand like a sleeping serpent. "Now," he said, his voice thick with satisfaction, "we'll see how long that proud spirit lasts." But as the first blow fell across Sophia's back, something happened that no one expected. Instead of crying out, instead of begging for mercy, she began to sing. One of them old songs Mama Cora had taught her, words in a language that predated slavery, melody that seemed to rise from the earth itself. And as her voice lifted over the plantation, other voices joined it. One by one, then all together, the slaves began to sing with her, their combined voices growing stronger with each note until the very air trembled with the power of their defiance. Silas raised his whip again, but for the first time in his cruel life, his hand hesitated, because in that moment, surrounded by the singing of people he'd thought he'd broken, he realized he wasn't facing one defiant slave. He was facing the collected rage of every soul Africa had lost to the Middle Passage, every spirit that had refused to be crushed by bondage, every ancestor who died fighting for freedom. And they were all speaking through Sophia of the whipping post, the woman who would carry iron nails in her neck for 45 days and still refuse to bow. Now listen close, children, because what I'm about to tell you shows how a spirit can grow stronger in the breaking, like iron forged in the hottest fire. That first night they left Sophia bound to them iron spikes. The whole plantation held its breath like the earth itself was waiting for something terrible to be born. The whipping post stood in that yard like a monument to cruelty, and Sophia hung there with her back pressed against 12 iron nails, each one sharp enough to pierce through to her soul. But here's the thing that made even Silas Thorne start to worry. That woman didn't make a sound. Not a whimper, not a cry, not even a whisper of pain. The other slaves, they took turns creeping close as they dared during their work, bringing her sips of water when the overseers weren't watching, whispering prayers in languages older than memory. Mama Cora came every evening just after sunset, carrying roots and herbs to tend the wounds as best she could. "Child," the old conjure woman would whisper, "you holding on to something that's bigger than this place, bigger than these white devils. Your ancestors walking with you. I can see them plain as day, standing guard like soldiers." And it was true. Folks started seeing things around that whipping post. Shadows that moved wrong, voices that carried on winds that weren't blowing, And sometimes, just sometimes, the outline of a woman in African dress standing behind Sophia with her hands placed protective on that girl's shoulders. By the third day, Silas Thorne was pacing like a caged panther. He'd expected Sophia to break by now, expected her to beg and plead and promise to be a good, obedient slave if only he'd let her down. Instead, she hung there like some kind of dark angel, her eyes burning with a fire that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. "What's wrong with that girl?" he muttered to one of the patty rollers who'd stayed to watch the show. "Ain't natural for someone to take that kind of punishment without breaking." The patty roller, a mean-faced man named Jeremiah Crow who'd been breaking slaves for 20 years, shook his head slow and thoughtful. "I've seen strong ones before, but this is something different. It's like she's drawing power from somewhere we can't see." That night, as the moon rose full and bright over the cotton fields, something happened that nobody expected. Sophia began to sing, not the work songs she'd sung before, but something deeper, older, more primal. It was a calling song, the kind that reached across the veil between the living and the dead and summoned spirits from their rest. The melody rose and fell like waves on an African shore, carrying words in languages that had been spoken in kingdoms of gold and ivory before the first slave ship ever touched water. And as she sang, the very air around the whipping post began to shimmer and dance, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Other slaves heard that singing and crept from their cabins despite the risk, drawn by something they couldn't name, but felt in their bones. They gathered in a circle around the whipping post, just far enough back to avoid the patty roller's notice, and one by one they began to join their voices to Sophia's. It was then that Silas Thorne realized he'd made a mistake bigger than pride and deeper than cruelty. He thought he was punishing one defiant slave, but what he'd actually done was create a focal point for every spirit on that plantation, living and dead, to gather and remember what they'd lost. The singing went on till dawn, and when the sun finally rose over them cotton fields, Sophia was still hanging there, still breathing, still defiant. But something had changed during the night. The other slaves moved different now, walked different, looked at the white folks different. Fear had changed sides, and when Silas Thorne looked into Sophia's eyes that morning, he saw something that chilled his blood. He saw his own death looking back at him. By the 7th day of Sophia's torment, word had spread beyond the boundaries of Wexford Manor like wildfire through dry grass. Slaves from neighboring plantations whispered her name in the cotton fields, spoke of the woman who wouldn't break, the spirit that grew stronger with each lash of the whip. Master Wexford himself came down from the big house to see what all the fuss was about, riding his black stallion through the slave quarters like some pale horseman of the apocalypse. He was a thin man with cold blue eyes and hands that had never known honest work, dressed in fine clothes bought with blood money. "This has gone on long enough," he told Silas Thorne as they stood looking at Sophia hanging from that cursed post. "Either break her today or put her out of her misery. This circus is disrupting the work, and disrupted work means lost profits." But Silas, he was past caring about cotton profits or plantation discipline. He'd become obsessed with breaking this one woman, like a man possessed by demons he couldn't name. "Give me more time, Colonel," he pleaded. "She's gotta break eventually. Ain't no human spirit can hold out forever." Colonel Wexford studied Sophia with the same cold assessment he might give a sick horse or a broken piece of machinery. "Look at her, Silas. Really look. Does that seem like a woman who's close to breaking?" And it was true. Despite 7 days hanging from iron spikes, despite the blood that had dried black on her neck and shoulders, despite the flies and the heat and the constant pain, Sophia looked more like an avenging angel than a broken slave. Her eyes still burned with that inner fire, and when she looked at the white men discussing her fate, there was no pleading in her gaze, only a promise that their time was coming. That afternoon, Silas tried a new form of torment. He brought little Timothy, the sick boy who'd started this whole nightmare, and made him stand in front of Sophia while he explained how her stubbornness was causing the child to suffer. "You see, boy, Silas said, his voice slick as snake oil. "This woman's pride is the reason you're going hungry. If she'd just admit she was wrong, ask for forgiveness like a good Christian slave, all this would be over." But Timothy, barely 8 years old and still weak from hunger, looked up at Sophia with eyes full of worship rather than blame. "Miss Sophia," he said, his young voice carrying clear across the yard, "you don't break for nobody. You show us all how to be strong." The words hit Silas like a physical blow, because in that moment he realized the truth. He hadn't broken Sophia's influence over the other slaves. He'd made her into something far more dangerous, a martyr, a symbol, a living testament to the power of resistance. That evening, as the work bells rang across the plantation and the slaves returned to their quarters, Mama Cora made her way to the whipping post with more than just roots and herbs. Hidden in her apron was a small cloth bundle containing graveyard dirt, red pepper, and a lock of hair from Sophia's own head, ingredients for a conjure work more powerful than any she'd ever attempted. "Child," she whispered as she knelt beside the post, "I'm gonna work a root on you tonight, but it ain't for healing. It's for strength. Your mama's spirit told me in a dream. She said the ancestors are gathering for something big, something that's gonna change everything." As Mama Cora worked her conjure, sprinkling the graveyard dirt in a circle around the post and muttering words in the old tongue, the air itself seemed to thicken and pulse with invisible power. Other slaves felt it too and began to gather, drawn by something stronger than curiosity or fear. They came despite the risk of punishment, despite the patty rollers watching from the shadows, despite everything they'd been taught about keeping their heads down and their voices quiet. They came because Sophia had shown them something they'd almost forgotten, that the human spirit, when it refuses to be broken, becomes something divine. And as they stood in that circle around the whipping post, each one carrying their own pain and their own dreams of freedom, something began to build in the air between them. Something that made the night birds stop singing, and the very stars seemed to burn brighter in the dark Mississippi sky. Silas Thorne felt it too, standing on the porch of his overseer's house, and for the first time in his cruel life, he knew what it felt like to be afraid. The 15th night brought a storm that seemed to rise from the very bowels of hell itself, with lightning that split the sky like God's own whip and thunder that shook the earth beneath their feet. But even as rain lashed the plantation and wind howled through the slave quarters like the voices of the damned, Sophia hung from that whipping post unmoved, unbroken, unbowed. The iron spikes had cut deep channels in her neck and shoulders by now, and her blood had mixed with the rain to paint dark streams down the weathered wood of the post. But still she sang, sometimes in English, sometimes in tongues that predated slavery, sometimes in sounds that seemed to come from the earth itself. Silas Thorne stood at his window watching that storm and listening to Sophia's voice rise above the wind. And he knew with the certainty of a man facing his own damnation that he'd lost more than just a battle of wills. He'd lost something fundamental about himself, something that had made him feel powerful and in control. "She's calling them," he whispered to himself, watching shadows move in the lightning flashes that didn't match any living thing he could see. Sweet Jesus, she's calling up the dead. And maybe she was. That night, as the storm raged and the boundary between the living world and the spirit realm grew thin as morning mist, every slave who'd ever died on Wexford Manor seemed to gather in that yard. The air filled with the whisper of voices speaking names that hadn't been heard in years. Sarah, who'd died in childbirth. Old Moses, who'd worked himself to death in the cotton fields. Little Emma, who'd been sold away from her mama and died of a broken heart. They came like an army of ghosts, drawn by Sophia's calling, and they stood witness to her suffering while promising something that made even the iron spikes tremble in the whipping post. In the slave quarters, folks huddled in their cabins and prayed while the storm raged outside. But their prayers weren't for the storm to end. They were for strength to see whatever was coming, because everyone could feel that something was building toward a moment that would change everything. Mama Cora sat in her cabin with the other elders, working roots by candlelight and speaking to spirits only she could see. "The girl's walking between worlds now," she told them, her ancient voice barely audible above the storm. "She ain't just Sophia anymore. She's become something bigger. She's become the voice of all our suffering, all our rage, all our dreams of freedom. "What's gonna happen?" asked Sarah Bell, a young woman with scars on her back from Silas Thorne's whip. "What's she calling down on this place?" Mama Cora looked up from her conjure work, her eyes reflecting the candle flame like twin stars in the darkness. "Justice," she said simply. "Justice that's been sleeping too long. Justice that's hungry for the taste of oppressor's blood. And when justice wakes up from a long sleep, it don't show no mercy." Meanwhile, in the big house, Colonel Wexford paced his study while thunder shook the windows and rain hammered the roof. He'd sent word to neighboring plantations, calling for help with what he now realized was a situation beyond his control. Because it wasn't just about one defiant slave anymore. It was about the symbol she'd become, the hope she'd given to every enslaved soul in the county. "Sir," his house slave Marcus said, entering the study with a tray of bourbon and the kind of careful neutrality that had kept him alive for 40 years. "The men you sent for, they can't get through. Roads are washed out from the storm." Colonel Wexford poured himself a glass of whiskey with shaking hands and stared out at the yard where Sophia hung from the whipping post like some dark crucifixion. "How long can she last?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, then said something that chilled his master's blood. "Sir, I don't think lasting is the point anymore. I think she's waiting for something. And when it comes..." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. As if summoned by his words, lightning struck the old oak tree at the edge of the slave quarters, splitting it down the middle with a crack like the world breaking in half. In the flash of light that followed, every living soul on Wexford Manor saw the same thing. Sophia raising her head toward the sky as if she was greeting an old friend, her voice lifted in a song that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. And in that moment, everyone knew that the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was coming. Because Sophia of the whipping post had called down something older than America, older than slavery, older than the memory of pain itself. She'd called down the collected rage of Africa, and it was finally ready to answer. 21 days, children. 21 days and nights Sophia hung from them iron spikes, and by now even the white folks were starting to whisper that something unholy was walking among them. The wounds in her neck had stopped bleeding. Not from healing, mind you, but from something else entirely. Something that made the very air around that whipping post hum with power older than sin itself. The other slaves, they'd taken to calling her the woman who wouldn't die, and they said it with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints and spirits. Because that's what Sophia was becoming. Not quite human anymore, but not quite gone from this world either. She was walking that thin line between life and death, between the flesh and the eternal, and drawing strength from places that scared even Mama Cora. "Lord have mercy," the old conjure woman whispered as she made her nightly visit to the post. "Child, your spirit's traveling in realms I ain't never seen. You speaking with powers that make my root work look like children's games." And it was true. Every night now, Sophia would fall into trances that lasted hours. Her eyes rolled back white as cotton bolls, her voice speaking words in languages that predated Egypt, that carried the wisdom of kingdoms lost to desert sands and jungle vines. During these times, the other slaves swore they could see figures gathering around her. Tall, proud spirits, wearing the gold and ivory of African royalty, their hands raised in blessing and protection. Silas Thorne, meanwhile, was coming apart like wet rope in a storm. He hadn't slept properly in weeks, jumping at shadows and hearing voices that called his name from empty rooms. His hands shook when he tried to hold his whip, and more than once he'd been seen talking to himself in the overseer's house, arguing with people who weren't there. "She's cursed me," he told Colonel Wexford during one of their increasingly desperate meetings. "That witch has put some kind of African devil magic on me. I see things, Colonel, terrible things. Dead slaves following me around, whispering my sins back to me." Colonel Wexford, who'd been losing sleep himself, poured another glass of bourbon with hands that weren't quite steady. "Maybe it's time we cut our losses, Silas. Maybe we should just end this, put a bullet in her head and be done with it. But Silas shook his head, fierce and frantic. Can't do that, sir. Something tells me that killing her now would just make things worse. She ain't fighting this world anymore. She's fighting from someplace else, someplace where bullets don't mean nothing. That same night, as the moon hung full and pregnant over the plantation, Sophia began to prophesy. Her voice carried clear across the slave quarters, speaking of things to come with the certainty of someone who'd seen the future written in blood and stars. I see trains running underground, she said, her voice echoing strangely in the still air. I see chains breaking from Charleston to Richmond. I see masters fleeing from their big houses while the fields burn behind them. I see a war coming, a war that'll wash this land clean with the blood of the guilty. The slaves listening felt chills run down their spines because they could hear truth in her words. Not hope, but knowledge. She wasn't predicting the future so much as remembering it, like someone who'd already lived through what was yet to come. And I see him, Sophia continued, her blind white eyes turning toward the overseer's house where Silas Thorne cowered behind locked doors. I see the man who thinks chains can hold spirit, who thinks pain can break what God and ancestors made strong. I see his end, and it tastes like justice delayed but not denied. Young Timothy, who'd grown stronger despite the reduced rations, crept close to the whipping post and whispered, Miss Sophia, when's it gonna happen? When's this all gonna end? Sophia's eyes rolled back to normal for just a moment, and she looked down at the boy with something that might have been a smile. Soon, child. Real soon now. The ancestors are gathering their strength, and when they move like lightning. You just keep yourself ready, 'cause when justice comes calling, it don't wait for nobody. That night, every slave on Wexford Manor dreamed the same dream. They saw Sophia standing free, her hands raised toward heaven, while the whipping post burned behind her like a funeral pyre for all the suffering it had witnessed. And when they woke, they knew the end was coming. 30 days into Sophia's crucifixion, the very nature of time seemed to bend and twist around Wexford Manor like heat waves rising from sun-baked clay. Days felt like years, nights stretched eternal, and even the sun seemed reluctant to shine full on a place where such darkness had taken root. The plantation's routine had all but collapsed. Slaves moved through their work like sleepwalkers, their eyes constantly drawn to that figure hanging motionless from the whipping post. Cotton went unpicked, tools lay forgotten in the fields, and even the animals seemed skittish and strange, as if they could sense something building in the air that human eyes couldn't see. Master Wexford had taken to his study with a bottle of whiskey and a loaded pistol, refusing to come out even for meals. His house slaves whispered that he spent his days writing frantic letters to relatives up north, begging them to send help or advice about dealing with what he now called an unnatural situation. But it was Silas Thorne who showed the clearest signs of a man touched by forces beyond his understanding. He'd stopped eating, stopped washing, stopped doing much of anything except pacing his cabin and muttering about eyes in the dark and voices that won't stop singing. His hair had gone white as cotton in just 2 weeks, and his hands shook so bad he could barely hold a cup of water. She's killing me slow, he told Jeremiah Crow, the patty roller who'd stayed on to see how this all played out. Every night she calls up more spirits, and they all want a piece of me. I see children I sold away from their mothers, men I worked to death in the fields, women He couldn't finish the sentence, but his meaning hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Jeremiah, who'd broken hundreds of slaves in his 20-year career, shook his head in amazement. I never seen nothing like this, Silas. That woman's become something that ain't natural. Maybe it's time we admitted we're dealing with powers beyond our understanding. But Silas, driven half mad by guilt and terror, refused to give up. I'll break her, he insisted, though his voice cracked like a young boy's. I'll find a way. No slave's gonna get the better of me, no matter what kind of devil magic she's using. That evening, as the sun set blood red over the cotton fields, Sophia began to sing a new song, one that seemed to come from the earth itself, rising up through the roots of trees and the bones buried in plantation soil. It was a calling song, but different from the others. This one wasn't summoning spirits from the past. This one was calling the future. As her voice rose and fell with the rhythm of African drums that only she could hear, strange lights began to dance around the whipping post. Not fireflies or lantern glow, but something else. Something that pulsed with the heartbeat of the earth and painted the night air in colors that had no names. The slaves gathered as they did every evening, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the night before everything changed forever. Even the children could sense it, clinging to their mother's skirts and staring wide-eyed at the figure hanging from those iron spikes like a dark angel waiting for her wings. Mama Cora, bent low with age and carrying more conjure power than any woman should rightfully possess, made her way to the front of the gathering. In her gnarled hands, she carried a bundle wrapped in red cloth, something she'd been preparing for weeks, waiting for the right moment. "Tonight," she announced to the assembled slaves, her voice carrying despite her advanced years, "tonight we bear witness to something that ain't happened since our people were kings and queens in the motherland. Tonight we see justice wake up from her long sleep." She unwrapped the bundle to reveal a small clay figure, a representation of Sophia, carved with symbols that hurt the eyes to look at directly. Around its neck was a necklace made of real iron nails, and its eyes were two small pieces of obsidian that seemed to hold starlight. "This here's a vessel," Mama Cora explained as she placed the figure at the base of the whipping post. "A place for all our ancestors' power to gather, a focus for all our pain and hope and righteous anger. Tonight, that power's gonna find its way into flesh and blood." As if responding to her words, Sophia's singing grew louder, more complex, harmonizing with voices that came from everywhere and nowhere. The air around the post began to shimmer and twist, and for a moment, just a moment, every person present could see them. Thousands of spirits stretching back through centuries of suffering, all raising their voices together in a song of liberation that shook the very foundations of hell. And in that moment, Sophia opened her eyes for the first time in days, and they burned with the light of every star that had ever watched over a slave ship crossing the dark Atlantic. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice carrying impossible distances in the still night air. "Tomorrow the debt comes due. 41 days. 41 days of hanging from them iron spikes." And Sophia had become something that existed more in the realm of legend than flesh. Her body was barely recognizable as human anymore, thin as a willow switch, marked with wounds that should have killed any mortal soul, but her spirit, Lord have mercy, her spirit blazed brighter than the noonday sun. The morning of the 41st day brought with it an unnatural silence that settled over Wexford Manor, like a burial shroud. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the whole world was waiting for something momentous to unfold. Silas Thorne hadn't slept in 3 days, and it showed in every line of his haggard face. He stood at his cabin window, staring at that motionless figure hanging from the post, and he knew with the certainty of a condemned man that today was the day his sins would finally catch up with him. "She's been calling something," he whispered to himself, his voice hoarse from fear and sleeplessness. "All these nights, all that singing. She's been calling something down from wherever spirits dwell, and today it's gonna answer." He was right to be afraid. That morning, as the sun climbed reluctantly into a sky the color of old blood, every slave on the plantation could feel it. A gathering of power that made the very air thick as molasses, and twice as sweet with the promise of justice long delayed. Colonel Wexford, driven by desperation and a bottle of bourbon that had become his constant companion, finally emerged from his study with a pistol in his hand and madness in his eyes. He'd made his decision sometime during the long night, though whether it came from wisdom or cowardice only the Lord could say. "Enough," he declared, striding across the yard toward the whipping post with the unsteady gait of a man who'd drunk too much and slept too little. "This ends today. I should have put a bullet in her head weeks ago." But as he approached Sophia, something happened that stopped him dead in his tracks. She raised her head, slowly, deliberately, and looked at him with eyes that held depths no living person should possess. When she spoke, Her voice carried the weight of continents and the wisdom of ages. "Colonel Beauregard Wexford," she said, pronouncing each syllable like she was reading his true name from the Book of Judgment itself. "Son of Thomas Wexford, who built his fortune on stolen flesh, grandson of William Wexford, who branded children like cattle. You stand before me thinking that gun in your hand gives you power, but you're wrong." The pistol trembled in Wexford's grip as something cold as Winter Creek water ran down his spine. "You're just a slave," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Just property, just—" "I am the voice of every soul sold on Charleston's auction block," Sophia continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I am the cry of every mother who watched her children disappear into the cotton fields of strangers. I am the rage of every father who died with shackles on his wrists and chains around his heart. And today, Colonel, I am your judgment." The slaves who had gathered to watch this final confrontation felt the power building in the air like electricity before a storm. Children pressed closer to their mothers while the elders began to hum. Not work songs this time, but something older, something that seemed to call up strength from the very bones of the earth. Silas Thorne, unable to bear the tension any longer, came stumbling out of his cabin with his own pistol drawn. His face was the color of old paper, and his eyes held the wild look of a man who'd stared too long into darkness and seen it staring back. "Shut up," he screamed at Sophia, his voice cracking like a breaking stick. "Shut your mouth, you devil. You ain't nothing but a stubborn slave who don't know when she's beaten." But even as he raised his weapon, even as his finger tightened on the trigger, Sophia began to laugh. It was a sound unlike anything any of them had ever heard. Not bitter or broken, but rich with joy and power and the absolute certainty of victory. "You still don't understand," she said, looking from Wexford to Silas with something that might have been pity. "You think this is about one woman hanging from one post. You think this is about your whips and your chains and your little cruelties. But it ain't." She paused, letting the silence stretch until it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. "This is about justice. And justice, when it finally comes, don't care about your guns or your power or your white skin. Justice just cares about the debt that's owed, and gentlemen, your account is way past due." As if summoned by her words, a wind began to blow. Not from any earthly direction, but from someplace else entirely. It carried the scent of African soil and Atlantic salt, the sound of drums and the whisper of prayers in forgotten languages. And in that wind, every person present could hear them coming. The footsteps of the dead, marching toward a reckoning 41 days in the making. The 42nd day dawned with a stillness so complete, it felt like the world itself had stopped breathing. Not a leaf stirred on the great oaks, not a single bird dared to sing, and even the Mississippi River seemed to flow quieter, as if it knew that something sacred and terrible was about to unfold on its banks. Sophia hung from them iron spikes like she'd been crucified on the altar of human cruelty. But anyone with eyes to see could tell she wasn't dying. She was transforming. Her body had become thin as smoke, almost translucent in the early morning light, but her spirit, Lord have mercy, her spirit filled the entire plantation like thunder fills the sky. The slaves gathered earlier than usual that morning, moving through the gray dawn like sleepwalkers drawn by a power they couldn't name but felt in every bone. They formed their circle around the whipping post, but this time it felt different. Not like a vigil for the dying, but like a congregation waiting for a miracle. Silas Thorne and Colonel Wexford stood on opposite sides of the yard, each man armed and desperate, but neither quite brave enough to approach the post where Sophia waited. Both had spent the night seeing things that couldn't be there. Shadows that moved with purpose, voices that whispered accusations, and always, the feeling of being watched by eyes that judged without mercy. "She's calling them up," Silas muttered, his hands shaking so bad he could barely hold his pistol steady. "All night long, calling up every slave that ever died on this plantation. They're coming, Colonel. I can feel them gathering." And maybe they were. That morning, as the sun climbed higher but somehow failed to burn away the strange mist that clung to the ground, the very air around Wexford Manor began to shimmer with presences that existed just beyond the edge of sight. The living could sense them. Thousands of spirits, maybe millions, stretching back through centuries of bondage and pain. Mama Cora, bent with age but steady in purpose, stepped forward from the circle of slaves and raised her gnarled hands toward heaven. "Ancestors," she called out in a voice that carried despite its age. "Your daughter has suffered long enough. She's paid the price in blood and tears. Now come and claim what's yours." The response was immediate and overwhelming. A wind rose from nowhere, carrying voices in languages that predated slavery, that spoke of kingdoms where black skin was royalty and freedom was birthright. It swirled around the whipping post like a hurricane made of memory and rage, lifting Sophia's hair and making her torn dress flutter like the wings of some dark angel. And in that wind, everyone present heard them. The voices of the dead, speaking names that history had tried to forget. Sarah, who died giving birth to her master's unwanted child. Old Moses, who worked himself to death picking cotton under the merciless sun. Little Emma, who was sold away from her mama at the age of 5 and never saw love again. They spoke, and they demanded justice. Colonel Wexford raised his pistol with trembling hands, but as he tried to aim at Sophia, something grabbed his wrist. Something he couldn't see but could certainly feel. Cold fingers strong as iron chains that twisted his arm until the gun fell from his nerveless grasp. "No," said a voice that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Not yet. She must choose her own moment." Sophia opened her eyes then, and they blazed with the light of every star that had ever looked down on a slave ship crossing the dark Atlantic. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of prophets and the power of righteousness too long delayed. 43 days, she said, and each word fell like a hammer blow on the hearts of every person present. 43 days I've hung here, paying for crimes I never committed, suffering for the sin of being born with skin that you decided was worth less than your cotton and your comfort. She looked directly at Silas Thorne, and he felt his soul shrivel under her gaze. "But suffering ain't all I've been doing, white man. I've been calling and they've been answering. Every slave that ever died under your whip, every child that ever cried for a mama sold downriver, every man that ever felt the auctioneer's gavel seal his fate. They're all here now." The mist around the plantation began to take shape, forming figures that walked with the proud bearing of African royalty, despite the chains that still bound their spectral forms. They gathered behind Sophia like an army of the righteous dead, waiting for the word that would unleash centuries of accumulated rage. 2 more days, Sophia whispered, and her voice carried to every corner of the plantation. 2 more days, and then the 45th dawn will rise on a world where the debt is finally paid in full. As if in response to her words, thunder rolled across the clear morning sky, and every white person on Wexford Manor felt the cold touch of judgment on their souls. The 44th day arrived wrapped in fog so thick it seemed solid, like the plantation had been swallowed by clouds that tasted of ocean salt and African earth. The mist moved wrong, against the wind, with purpose and intelligence that made even the bravest souls uneasy in their skin. By now, the transformation of Sophia was nearly complete. She hung from them iron spikes, more spirit than flesh, her body so thin it seemed she might dissolve into the morning air at any moment. But her eyes, sweet Jesus, her eyes burned with the collected fury of 4 centuries of bondage, and anyone who looked into them saw their own judgment written in flames. The slaves moved through their morning routine like actors in a play, going through the motions of picking cotton and tending livestock, while their hearts and minds focused entirely on the woman hanging from the whipping post. Work songs had been replaced by hymns, and hymns had given way to chants in languages that belonged to no earthly nation. Colonel Wexford hadn't left his study in 2 days, barricaded behind locked doors with a rifle across his lap and a bottle of whiskey for company. The few house slaves brave enough to bring him food reported that he spent his time writing frantically in a leather journal, setting down confessions of crimes that would make the devil himself weep. But it was Silas Thorne who showed the clearest signs of a man touched by divine retribution. He wandered the plantation like a ghost himself, talking to people who weren't there, arguing with voices only he could hear. His hair had gone white as cotton bolls, His hands shook like autumn leaves, and his eyes held the haunted look of someone who'd seen his own soul weighed and found wanting. "She's done it," he muttered to anyone who would listen, though most folks gave him a wide berth these days. "She's called up an army of the dead, and they're coming for me. I can hear them whispering my name, listing my sins like items at auction." That evening, as darkness fell over the plantation like a burial shroud, Sophia began to glow. Not with earthly light, but with something deeper, the luminescence of spirits who had transcended the boundaries between life and death. The iron spikes that had pierced her neck for 44 days began to shine like molten silver, and the blood that had dried black on the whipping post turned red as fresh roses. The slaves gathered for what they all knew would be the last vigil, forming their circle with the solemnity of people attending a resurrection. Mama Cora stepped forward, carrying a bundle wrapped in white cloth, the burial shroud she'd been weaving for weeks from threads pulled from garments of the dead. "Tomorrow," she announced to the assembled crowd, her ancient voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Tomorrow our sister chooses her moment. Tomorrow the ancestors reclaim what was stolen and exact the price that's been building interest for 400 years. As if responding to her words, Sophia raised her head and looked out over her people with eyes that held both infinite sadness and boundless love. "My brothers and sisters," she said, and her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I want you to remember this night. I want you to remember that no chain is stronger than the spirit, no whip more powerful than the will to be free." She paused, letting her gaze rest on each face in turn. Men and women who had suffered under the lash, children who had known nothing but bondage, elders who carried memories of Africa in their bones. "Tomorrow, when justice comes calling, I want you to stand tall. I want you to remember that you are descendants of kings and queens, children of the sun and stars, heirs to kingdoms that existed before Europe dreamed of ships to carry them across the ocean." A young woman named Sarah Bell, who bore scars from Silas Thorne's whip, stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. "Miss Sophia," she asked, "what's going to happen to us after tomorrow? When this is all over?" Sophia smiled then, and it was like watching the sun rise after the longest night in history. "Child, what's going to happen is you're going to be free. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but soon. The wheel's been set in motion and it won't stop turning until every chain is broken and every slave quarter stands empty." She looked toward the overseer's house where Silas Thorne cowered behind locked doors, and her voice took on the weight of prophecy. "And those who profited from our pain, those who built their fortunes on our backs and their comfort on our tears, they're going to learn that there's a price for everything, and some debts can only be paid in blood." That night, no one slept. The slaves sat in their cabins, singing softly and sharing stories of the homeland their grandparents remembered. The white folks huddled in their houses, jumping at every shadow and praying to a God they weren't sure would listen to prayers stained with the sin of slavery. And Sophia hung from her cross of iron and wood, glowing like a beacon in the darkness, calling down the final reckoning with a voice that carried across dimensions. At midnight, as the 45th day began, thunder rolled across the clear sky, and every soul on Wexford Manor knew that the end was finally at hand. The 45th day. Lord have mercy, children. The 45th day dawned like the end of the world, and the beginning of justice, all wrapped up in one blood-red sunrise. The air itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, thick as molasses, and sweet with the promise of deliverance too long delayed. Sophia hung from them, iron spikes transformed into something beyond human understanding. Part woman, part spirit, part living symbol of every injustice ever committed on American soil. The wounds in her neck had stopped bleeding days ago, sealed now with power that made the very atoms of her being shine like captured starlight. The plantation had become a place outside normal time and space. Clocks stopped working, shadows fell wrong, and the Mississippi River ran backward for 3 miles, carrying the bodies of slaves who had drowned trying to escape upriver towards some kind of mystical freedom. Colonel Wexford finally emerged from his study that morning, but he was no longer the proud plantation master who had ruled over 3,000 acres like a king. He was a broken man, hollow-eyed and shaking, clutching his grandfather's dueling pistol like a drowning man holds driftwood. "I can't take it anymore," he whispered to no one in particular as he stumbled across the yard toward the whipping post. The voices, the accusations, the faces of children I sold away from their mothers. "Make it stop. Please, God, just make it stop." But Silas Thorne was the first to break completely. He came running out of his cabin like a man pursued by demons, screaming incoherently about eyes in the darkness and hands that won't let go. In his madness, he saw only one solution. If he could kill Sophia, maybe the haunting would end. He raised his pistol with hands that shook like autumn leaves and aimed at the woman who had become his personal torment. "Die!" he shrieked, his voice cracking like a breaking branch. "Why won't you just die?" But as his finger tightened on the trigger, as the moment of truth finally arrived after 45 days of suffering and resistance, Sophia did something that no one expected. She smiled. And in that smile was forgiveness for the sinner and damnation for the sin, mercy for the repentant, and judgment for the unrepentant. It was the smile of someone who had walked through hell and emerged with their soul not only intact, but purified by the fires of injustice. "Silas Thorne," she said, and her voice carried the authority of judges and the power of prophecies fulfilled. "Man of cruelty and keeper of chains. Do you think that little gun in your shaking hands can stop what's been set in motion? Do you think death holds any fear for someone who has already died 1,000 times in life?" As she spoke, the mist that had clung to the plantation for days began to swirl and thicken, taking the shape of countless figures, men, women, and children who had suffered and died under the whips of overseers like Silas. They surrounded him like an army of the righteous dead, their eyes burning with the light of justice too long denied. "You want me to die?" Sophia continued, and now there was steel in her voice, the kind that cuts through bone and sinew straight to the soul. "Then let me die, but know this, white man. My death will not be the end, it will be the beginning. Every drop of blood I've shed, every tear I've cried, every moment of pain you've inflicted will echo through eternity until justice is satisfied." Silas pulled the trigger then, but instead of the sharp crack of gunpowder, there was only the hollow click of a weapon that refused to fire. He tried again and again, pulling the trigger until his finger bled, but the pistol remained silent. "Your time is finished," Sophia said, and now the iron spikes that had held her for 45 days began to bend and twist of their own accord. "But mine is just beginning." The ropes that bound her to the post snapped like gossamer threads, and Sophia stepped forward for the first time in 45 days. Her feet touched the red clay earth of Mississippi, and where she stepped, flowers bloomed. Not the cultivated roses of the big house garden, but wild African violets that had never grown in American soil. Silas Thorne, faced with the impossible sight of his victim walking free, fell to his knees and began to pray, in a voice thick with terror. But it was too late for prayers, too late for repentance, too late for anything but the reckoning that had been building like storm clouds for 45 days and 45 nights. Sophia reached down and picked up one of the iron spikes that had fallen from the post. It glowed in her hand like molten gold, humming with power that made the very air around it tremble. She looked at Silas with eyes that held no hatred, only the terrible certainty of justice finally served. "You wanted to break me," she said, raising the spike above her head. "Instead, you freed me. You wanted to show your power over flesh and spirit. Instead, you showed me the power that comes from suffering transformed into strength." And with those words, with the accumulated power of 45 days of torment, and the blessing of 10,000 ancestral spirits, Sophia brought the spike down with such force that it drove through Silas Thorne's skull and deep into the red earth beneath, pinning him to the soil he had watered with so much innocent blood. The sound echoed across the plantation like thunder, like justice, like freedom itself finally finding its voice. When the iron spike pierced through Silas Thorne's skull and drove deep into that blood-soaked Mississippi earth, something broke open in the world, not just on Wexford Manor, but everywhere the shadow of slavery had fallen. A cry rose up from the red clay soil, a wail of liberation that had been building in the bones of the earth for centuries. The other slaves stood frozen in that moment between one world and another, watching their sister Sophia stand over the body of the man who had tormented them all. She was no longer the woman they had known. She was justice incarnate, terrible and beautiful, glowing with power that made the morning sun seem dim as candlelight. Colonel Wexford, who had witnessed the impossible death of his overseer, fell to his knees in the red dirt and began to weep. Not tears of sorrow, but tears of a man who finally understood the magnitude of his sins. "Lord, have mercy," he whispered, his voice breaking like a child's. "What have we done? Sweet Jesus, what have we done?" But Sophia turned to him with eyes that held depths no mortal gaze should possess. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every auction block, every slave ship, every family torn apart by the machinery of human bondage. "Colonel Beauregard Wexford," she said, and each word fell like judgment from heaven itself. "You ask what you have done. Look around you. Look at the children who have never known their fathers' names. Look at the mothers who have buried babies born of rape and violence. Look at the men who have worked themselves to death picking your cotton under the burning sun." She gestured to the slaves gathered around them, and for the first time Wexford truly saw them, not as property, not as tools, but as human beings whose lives he had destroyed for profit. "You have built your fortune on stolen flesh and broken spirits. You have traded in human souls like they were tobacco and cotton, and you ask what you have done." The iron spike in her hand began to glow brighter, humming with energy that made the very air shimmer and dance. But instead of raising it against the plantation master, Sophia drove it deep into the earth at the base of the whipping post, where it began to pulse like a heart made of molten metal. "This marker will remain," she declared, her voice carrying across the plantation like thunder across the delta. "It will stand as witness to the suffering endured here, as promise to the living and memorial to the dead. And it will remind the world that some debts can never be forgotten, some crimes can never be forgiven." As the spike settled into the earth, the whipping post itself began to change. The old wood, stained dark with the blood of countless victims, started to crack and split, falling away in pieces that crumbled to dust before they hit the ground. In its place, something new began to grow. Not a tree, but something that had never existed in the natural world. It rose from the red earth like a pillar of living iron, twisted and scarred but unbreakably strong, reaching toward heaven with branches that sang in languages older than America. And on those branches, instead of leaves, hung chains, not the chains of bondage, but chains of memory, each link inscribed with the name of a soul who had suffered and died in slavery. The slaves watched in wonder as their ancestors' names appeared in letters of fire on the metal branches. Thousands of names, tens of thousands, stretching back through generations of pain to the very first ship that had brought stolen Africans to these shores. "Remember them," Sophia said, and now her voice was growing fainter as if she were speaking from a great distance. "Remember their names, their stories, their dreams of freedom, and remember that their spirits live on in you, in your children, in every soul that refuses to be broken by oppression." The other paddy rollers who had stayed to witness this impossible day turned and fled then, running toward their horses with the kind of terror that comes from seeing the very foundations of your world crumble into dust. But they would carry the story with them, spreading word of what they had seen to every plantation from Georgia to Texas. And that word would spread like wildfire, giving hope to the hopeless and striking fear into the hearts of those who profited from human misery. Because everyone who heard the tale would know that something fundamental had changed, that the old order was cracking like ice in a spring thaw. Sophia looked one last time at the slaves who had been her people, her family, her strength during those 45 days of torment. "Be free," she whispered, and the words carried the force of law, of destiny, of divine commandment. "Be free in your hearts, and freedom will follow." Then she began to fade, becoming translucent as morning mist, her spirit finally ready to join the ancestors who had sustained her through those long nights of suffering. As Sophia's physical form began to dissolve into the morning light, the slaves of Wexford Manor felt something they had never experienced before: the absence of fear. For the first time in their lives, they stood on that plantation ground, without the weight of chains on their souls, without the crack of the whip echoing in their ears. Young Timothy, the boy whose hunger had started this whole chain of events, stepped forward and reached toward the spot where Sophia was fading. "Don't go, Miss Sophia," he pleaded, tears streaming down his face. "We need you here with us." But Sophia smiled, and her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, carried on a wind that smelled of African soil and Atlantic freedom. "Child, I ain't going nowhere. I'm gonna be in every song you sing, every prayer you whisper, every moment you choose courage over fear. I'm gonna be in the beating of your heart and the strength of your spirit." As she spoke, the other slaves began to feel it too, a warmth spreading through their chests, a power flowing into their limbs, a light kindling behind their eyes. It was as if something of Sophia's unbreakable spirit was being divided among them all, ensuring that her legacy would live on in every soul she had touched. Mama Cora, bent with age but steady in wisdom, stepped forward and raised her gnarled hands toward the fading figure. "Sister," she said, her ancient voice carrying clearly in the still air, "your work here is done. You've shown us what it means to be truly free, even in chains. You've reminded us that no earthly power can break the human spirit when it's connected to something greater." The old conjure woman turned to face the assembled slaves, her eyes bright with tears and determination. "But now it's our turn. Now we take what she's given us and use it to break the chains that still bind us. We take her example and spread it like seeds on the wind, until every plantation, every slave quarter, every auction block remembers the name of Sophia and what she stood for." As if responding to her words, the iron pillar that had grown from the whipping post began to sing, a low, haunting melody that seemed to carry the voices of all the ancestors whose names were inscribed on its twisted branches. Slaves joined their voices to that otherworldly chorus, creating a harmony that made the very earth tremble with power. Colonel Wexford, still kneeling in the dirt beside Silas Thorne's body, looked up at his former slaves with eyes that had been opened to truths he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. It was Sarah Bell who answered, the young woman who bore scars from the Overseer's whip, but now stood tall as any queen. "Now you learn what it means to reap what you've sown," she said, her voice steady as stone. "Now you face a world where we remember who we are. Not your property, not your tools, but human beings with souls as valuable as any white man's." The slaves began to move then, not running as escaped prisoners might, but walking with the measured dignity of people reclaiming their birthright. Some gathered their few possessions from the slave quarters. Others simply walked away with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the fire of freedom burning in their hearts. But they all paused at the iron pillar, touching its surface and whispering prayers of gratitude to the woman who had shown them the way. And as each hand touched that sacred metal, they felt it, the connection to something larger than themselves, the knowledge that they were part of a story that stretched back through centuries and forward into a future where freedom was not just a dream, but a destiny. Timothy was the last to leave, the boy whose moment of weakness had triggered this transformation. He stood before the pillar and spoke in a clear, strong voice that carried farther than his years should have allowed. "Miss Sophia," he said, "I promise you that I'll remember. I'll tell my children about you and they'll tell their children, and your story will live forever. And whenever somebody tries to break our spirit, whenever they try to make us forget who we are, we'll remember the woman who hung from iron spikes for 45 days and never broke." As the sun climbed higher in the Mississippi sky, Sophia's form finally faded completely, but her voice lingered on the wind like a benediction. "Go in peace, my people. Go in strength. Go in the knowledge that you are free, and that freedom, once truly claimed, can never be taken away." And so they went, walking toward horizons that suddenly seemed filled with possibility, carrying with them the story of a woman who had transformed suffering into power, pain into purpose, and death into eternal life. Years passed, children. Years turned to decades, and decades stretched into the long memory of a people who had learned that some stories are too important to forget. The plantation at Wexford Manor was abandoned within a month of Sophia's transformation. Its fields left to return to wilderness, while the iron pillars stood eternal guard over the ground, where so much suffering had been transformed into strength. Folks came from miles around to see that twisted monument, to touch its surface and hear the singing that rose from its branches when the wind blew just right. And every visitor left changed, carrying something of Sophia's unbreakable spirit back to their own plantations, their own struggles, their own dreams of freedom. The story spread like wildfire through the slave quarters of the South, passed from mouth to mouth in whispered conversations after the work bells stopped ringing. In Georgia and Alabama, in the Carolinas and Virginia, enslaved people told their children about the woman who wouldn't break, who showed them that the human spirit, when it refuses to bow, becomes something divine. Young Timothy grew up to become a preacher, traveling from plantation to plantation with the story of Sophia burning like scripture in his heart. He told anyone who would listen about the 45 days, about the iron spikes, about the moment when justice finally came calling with a voice that shook the heavens. "She showed us," he would say, his voice carrying the power of someone who had witnessed the impossible. That there's something in us that can't be chained, can't be whipped, can't be sold. Something that connects us to powers older than America, stronger than slavery, more enduring than the cruelty of men. Sarah Bell became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, guiding escaped slaves to freedom with a fearlessness that amazed even the bravest abolitionists. When asked where she found such courage, she would touch the small piece of iron she wore around her neck, a fragment that had fallen from Sophia's pillar, and say simply, "I learned from the best teacher there ever was." Mama Cora lived to be 103, long enough to see the first shots fired at Fort Sumter and know that the war Sophia had prophesied was finally beginning. On her deathbed, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had been born free because of sacrifices made before their time, she whispered her last words. "Tell Sophia we kept the faith. Tell her we remembered." And what of Colonel Wexford? He survived the war, but not the weight of his conscience. He spent his remaining years trying to make amends for a lifetime of cruelty, freeing slaves before the Emancipation Proclamation made it law, donating his fortune to schools for freed children, and spending his nights writing letters of apology to families he had torn apart. But redemption, real redemption, seemed always just beyond his reach. He would sometimes be seen at midnight, standing before Sophia's pillar with his head bowed in prayer, begging forgiveness from a spirit he could feel but never see. When he died, alone and repentant, folks said they heard the iron branches singing a different song, not of judgment but of mercy finally extended to a soul that had found its way home. The pillar itself became a place of pilgrimage, drawing visitors long after slavery ended and the plantation system crumbled into history. Union soldiers marched past it during the war, each man touching its surface for luck. Freed slaves brought their children to see where the legend was born. And even white folks, the ones with conscience enough to feel shame for their father's sins, would come to stand in its shadow and try to understand the price of their prosperity. Now, children, as I sit here by this fire that burns with the memory of ages, I can tell you that Sophia's story ain't finished. It lives on in every soul that refuses to be broken by injustice, in every voice that speaks truth to power, in every heart that beats with the rhythm of resistance. The iron pillar still stands, they say, though the plantation around it has long since returned to wilderness. Spanish moss hangs from its branches like prayers, and the names carved in its surface glow soft as starlight when the moon is dark. And sometimes, just sometimes, folks swear they can see her there, a woman of light and shadow, standing guard over the ground where freedom was born from suffering. She waits there still, watching over all who remember her story, blessing all who carry her spirit forward into whatever battles are yet to come. Because Sophia of the whipping post taught us something that tyrants never understand, that the human spirit, when it refuses to surrender to cruelty, becomes eternal. And her voice still echoes across the years, reminding us that we are more than our circumstances, stronger than our chains, and destined for something greater than the narrow vision of those who would keep us bound. Listen for it, children. Listen for that voice in the wind, in the singing of the iron branches, in the beating of your own hearts. Because Sophia's story is your story too, and her strength lives on in everyone who remembers that freedom, once truly claimed, can never be taken away. The memory of resistance burns eternal in the hearts of the oppressed, passed down through generations like sacred fire. And here we guard those flames, in the legends of the lost slave quarters.